Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Negotiating the Best Price for Your Business. My name is Kevin Uphill, and I'm the Chairman of Avondale Corporate. We'll have about 50 minutes today. I'm just going to run through some of the initial fundamentals and theory for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'll be joined by my colleague, Sally Hardman, to talk about some of her experience as one of our senior deal makers in the real world, rather than just the theory. At that point, we'd love to have some questions from you as well. For those of you who don't know Avondale, we specialise in the emerging mid-market, helping people buy and sell companies, traditionally the sort of 2 million to 50 million range. So as I say, we call that the emerging mid-market, or it's the quality end of the SME market, however you define it. There's a lot going on, but as ever, we need to get it right in order to be successful. And in terms of negotiation, our view is that a lot of deals get undersold, either because the seller hasn't negotiated well, or the buyer's been an exceptionally good negotiator and strong master, or the advisory team haven't protected them properly. So as we know, it's difficult to get deals across the line, and probably up to a third fail, but a third may well go through at below value simply because the negotiations haven't been handled correctly, and we need to really head that off at pass. So that's what today's about. For those of you who enjoyed today's webinar, we will be recording, so don't worry, and you may be able to share that therefore with colleagues, etc. The three biggest reasons deals get undersold: M&A is complex, you've got multiple elements, finance, legal, commercial, people, and therefore the whole arena requires preparation. And by far the biggest area in terms of negotiation is people are leaving it to the last minute. They haven't had a chance to scenario play. They're going off the wing, if you like, off the hoof, with a lack of preparation in the negotiation strategy, and quite simply, therefore, that lack of preparation tells, and they lose in the room. I think the other big area for sellers is that they don't see it from the other side's point of view. And of course, if you're going to win discussions, if you put yourself in the shoes of the other player, then you're more likely to understand them, and therefore more likely to anticipate, and therefore more likely to win when you're playing with them. And again, that all comes down to scenario planning when it actually comes to going into the room and negotiating. There are four really key elements to M&A negotiation, and we see that as the value, obviously, all cash and bigger price. So value is the most important. Deal structure, which is also about risk allocation. The more you pay up front, then the higher the risk of the deal. But then in risk allocation is very much where the lawyers will be your corporate warrior and earn their fee around the sale and purchase agreement. We'll talk about that more later. And then, of course, timing. Is it all cash? Is there deferred payments? Are we doing it now? Is it better to wait till the business has grown? All of those different elements come into it. So really four foundations to an M&A negotiation, or four fundamental elements that we need to keep in mind at every step. And what you're doing is you're balancing those to create a good recipe. So you're switching between them all, cash, deal, and risk allocation and timing, to create that hopefully win-win for both sides. And that is being balanced against the sustainability of the business and the business plan and where it's at and what all the sides are trying to achieve. So when we take those four elements, we then translate them to just some basic fundamentals of negotiation. And this is obviously a bit more generic, but we will cover some specifics later. But the number one rule is research and listening. So obviously, if you're going into a room, you're going into discussion, you need leverage, and you need to have an alternative strategy so that you can apply that leverage. For many sellers, that is keeping the business and making the comment that the price will go up, and having a clear strategy how to do that, because obviously then that drives buy-side interest. There's no good going into a room going, look, we're tired and we kind of don't know what to do with it. You've got no leverage there. But the other area that brings leverage is information, and knowledge is power. So you really need to study who you're going to go into a room with. You need to understand, look at their LinkedIn. What do they enjoy? What are their hobbies? What are their connections? If you go to the ultimate obsession, Facebook, It may give you some clues about their personal life, what past deals have they done, what's their track record, what's the strategy of the company that's buying or the financier that's buying. The more information you've got, the more power you've got, the more you can use that to your advantage. Now, this is where I then start falling down. I love to talk, as you could tell from the webinar, and actually as a negotiator, I don't necessarily use silence enough, and I certainly struggle sometimes with observation because I'm always thinking about what to say next. And actually the great negotiators really find ways to slow themselves down, take that breath, pause, and watch what's going on, because the body language in the room really dictates. The unspoken things often dictate more in the negotiation than the spoken, but also the silence is important. If you're saying no to someone, don't then carry on talking. And in fact, in some cultures, if you're negotiating, for example, with India, that simply won't work. If you carry on talking, they won't hear the no. So you do genuinely, in some cultures, have to say no and walk away, almost physically, kind of turn your back. So all of these elements come into it. And the research is not just research in knowing who you're talking to, but research in listening to how they behave. And I've put in here this picture, this is a jiu-jitsu picture. Basically, the more observational you are on the way that they tackle negotiations, the more you can use the opponent's body weight. So often a smaller opponent can actually beat a bigger opponent because they can see them coming at them and change angle to flip them more. And that's a really key part of M&A negotiation, particularly for sellers, because many sellers are selling to buyers that are more corporate, or financiers or investment people who've got more corporate experience and more money. So they feel in a position where they don't feel comfortable with it. So the more you listen, the more comfortable you will be. I do think mindset's important. I won't spend lots on this, but many people, particularly in the UK, don't really enjoy haggling. But M&A requires haggling. It is a yes, no, yes, no equation. Now, because we're generally brought up to be polite, we're told not to say no ever. I'm told that the UK cultural trait in negotiations from a Brexit perspective used to wind the Europeans up a lot, because our negotiation stance is very much yes, no, which really irritates people. So what we need to be clear on is there's nothing wrong with saying no. You need to say no, and you may need to do it firmly. We think the right approach is to have a sporting code and do so in a non-adversarial manner. So if you build trust with the other side, you can say no very, very firmly, but with a smile still on your face. We do not see negotiation as adversarial. This is not about, banging the desk, firmly slamming doors, drinking coffee. That doesn't work anymore. It's all about listening, building rapport, and then smiling quietly and saying no. That is a much more effective strategy. And when we look at M&A, it is like a game. I use the chess analogy. If you're going into negotiations and you've prepared and you've thought about your scenarios, you will have thought 4 moves ahead. And if you've ever played chess, you'll know that if you play chess and you think 4 moves ahead, but you're only playing against someone who thinks 2 moves ahead, then invariably you'll win. But also you know your pieces, so you know what your possible moves are with the different elements of your business. Now, I think actually, when I look at the chess analogy, it's quite interesting. I've been playing my son Dominic a lot at chess recently. We've moved over to a chess app, and the chess app has a timer on it. Now, I used to win, my rating was higher. The minute you put the timer on, it takes me apart. Well, it's much more even, put it that way. So it's quite interesting. Clearly, I know the pieces, I know the strategy, but I don't think fast enough. Now, that's probably an age thing, but it is important because actually your ability to think fast enough in a room is probably back to practice before you go in the room. And the more you practice your scenarios, the more likely you are to make the moves and win. And that's for us as tactical negotiation as well. So I said, think of M&A as having pieces, and then you move them. Well, you've got tactical moves. And ultimately, we've got tradables. You might trade a piece for another piece in order to get more advantage on the board. But the tactics are quite common, and a good advisory team will signpost those for you. They will point out when they're being employed. Of course, the classic tactic, shock opening bid. They come in low with a load of justifications. But if you spend your time on those justifications, guess what? You're adding fuel to them. It's far better to quite simply say, no, we've got an alternative strategy, have a think, and not get terribly upset or take it terribly seriously. It's deliberately done to undermine you. And of course, if you're buying, you want to buy low, and if you're selling, you want to sell high, right? So shock opening bid is all part of that game. I think probably the most used tactic we see in M&A is the third-party referral. So the third-party referral is always Mr. Samuto in Japan or Mr. Richard in America. There's some third party that we can't get to who's making the ultimate decisions. And that, of course, is the reason why we get a no, or we can't do it like that. And of course, that's really difficult to circumnavigate because you can't get access to that party. So again, just recognizing it's a tactic employed, and then you may need to alter your negotiation approach accordingly. And we do this a lot when we're working on deals. We create a list of our pieces, our tradables, and then we look at what is important to us and what isn't. So, come back to timing. An earnout may not be a big issue for us if we've got a fast growth business and we're going to be able to control and influence that earnout. If the buyer, however, is taking over, then it becomes more important to push for an all-cash deal. So tradables are looking at what's important to you in the circumstance against the buyer, and then creating a list of what you're prepared to give away in order to gain. And of course, when we look at that, the giveaway points, you want to give the small points, maybe make them look like big points, but in order to win the big points. And there's a lot of games going back to tactics playing on this, tactics of confusion. Very often, and buyers, of course, will never tell you what are their big points. Why would they? So very often you're trying to second guess what are the big points versus the small points. But again, planning and understanding what's important to you before you go into the room is utterly critical with this equation. So tradables, which are kind of your pieces when you go into a room. And if you're doing all this negotiation, ultimately the end goal of the discussions from buyer and seller is to get to a completion. But the step before that is a heads of terms. So in M&A, the heads of terms, not normally legally binding apart from exclusivity and confidentiality, but they are the commercial foundation for the business. And they should set out the handshake, if you like, between the parties. And that creates the moral obligation during the deal. It typically takes 6 to 9 months to get a deal, create an auction, create bids, and then you're looking at 3 to 4 months to get a deal across the line. But actually, once you've given the heads of terms, typically that 3 months to completion, you will have given exclusivity. So it's really important, because you're cutting out any other potential buyers at that point. It's really important that heads of terms reflects the deal. It's really important there's no ambiguities. And ambiguities tend to come in when people haven't spent enough time on heads of terms. So, we're really enthusiastic, we want to do a deal, it's great, we're all excited, we've got this win-win in front of us, and so we rush it. And the problem with that is that the detail isn't necessarily thought through. But the other issue you have with heads of terms, which, perhaps is a house style at our end that irritates us, but oh my God, do corporate buyers and some private equity make them overcomplicated, and they deliberately use jargon to create that ambiguity, which of course then gives them scope to move the deal about after the handshake. So that's a real issue. So for us, keep it simple, keep it clear, remove ambiguity, but cover all the key bases. And it's really important to slow the deal up till you've got that crafted. I think it's a critical part of M&A. Well, we mentioned earlier the four foundations of M&A: value, structure, timing, and risk. And of course, value, all cash, structure, what is of earnouts, and so on, and timing. We've kind of discussed how long are those earnouts or payments, or is it better to delay the deal? But of course, risk is actually central to M&A, because for both sides, it's about return on investment. Are you selling for enough? Are they paying too much? And will they get a return? So that risk allocation changes potentially after a deal, because in the UK, we have a sale and purchase agreement, and the lawyers will balance in the sale and purchase agreement the history of the business in that document. I love the Donald Rumsfeld quote up here, because as we know, there are known things we don't know, and we also know there are known unknowns, and there are things we don't know. So I think, what he's really trying to say is we just don't know the past. We don't know the history. You are selling the shares of your company. That buyer is picking up on that history, because it's, people can make claims after you've sold. The company still exists. It's still the entity. So we've got to apportion that history between the buyer and seller. Now, the way you do that is you create a sold as seen situation. So in the UK, we have caveat emporium, which is buyer beware. So if you have told people about it, they can't then later argue, well, that impacts on value, right? So we have a disclosure process. And that disclosure is really critical. And the more detail you put into that disclosure, the more you create that sold as seen, the less they can future argue that there's value impact. There's warranties which are undertaken to cover claims that may come up in the business in the future, or contingent liabilities that may come up in the future that we didn't know about, but they are protected by the buyer having to prove a loss of value in the deal. And indemnities, when you come to the SPA, are all about the known liabilities. So I don't know, if you've got a particular tax scheme or a particular legal claim, then we've got a pretty good idea what that contingent risk is, and then we can allocate it between buyer and seller in the SPA. So there's an art to A, making sure the disclosure is good, B, what should you want, what shouldn't you, what should you indemnify, what shouldn't you? And a good example, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but great warranty you get asked is, well, can you warranty the forecast? Well, no, there are forecasts. What we can do is say that we've reasonably prepared them. So that's the sort of stuff that we have to battle through when we're looking at risk allocation. Four fundamentals: value, timing, risk, and structure. A deal structure is the more cash you get at completion, the lower the risk. And deal structure is a value influencer. So this slide reminds us that the bigger the multiple, generally the bigger the profits, and the more strategic the buyer, generally the bigger the multiple. But actually also risk in terms of deal structure can be a multiple influencer. In theory, the more earnout that the buyer has, the less cash they put up front, the more they can pay because of net present value of money. Money paid out today costs more than money paid out tomorrow is the fundamentals of that. So when you're looking at allocation of risk through deal structure, of course, an all-cash deal is very low risk and therefore worth more. And a short period, if there are any deferred payments or earnouts, is low risk and therefore worth more. The longer the period, the higher the risks. Okay, so the order of priority, if you look on the right-hand side here, cash is king, short periods. If you're not going to get cash, escrow, money being held back on account. We've got a deal at the moment with a big American buyer. It is all cash, it's corporate PLC, but they put a retention in escrow. I think it's 600,000. But the nice thing about that, there's no deferred payments, there's no earnouts, there's no squabble as who did what after the deal. It's more covering the risk of warranties and potentially any indemnity claim. So cash is king, escrow next, then deferred payment. And as we go up the scale, it becomes higher risk. You've got earnouts. Earnouts on gross profits, very easy to define. Earnouts on profit, higher risk, harder to define. And of course, if you've got earnouts, are we in control or are they in control? And those are all, again, about risk allocation. But that is around the deal structure on the value actually paid over. And then we come back to the whole principle of disclosure, which we discussed in terms of value. So, I mean, the way we do it, marketing data room, we present a lot more information to create a sold as seen position. That means that when you're at heads of terms and you've agreed it, they can't say, oh, well, we didn't really understand what we were buying after the deal, and therefore later come in with what is known as deal attrition or possibly even tire kicking. Oh, well, we've done our due diligence, we've looked at it, we didn't really understand it, we don't like this now, we need to drop the price. So the more transparent you are in creating the market, the less issues you have with deal attrition. But if you've got that right, and you do that for a marketing data room, then you can convert that to a deal data room, and then that, of course, then flips into the disclosure process of the sold as seen situation. So you're able to use a good data room for marketing, but then you can flip it into a disclosure process so that buyers have got a real snapshot of the business and they can't say they didn't know about it. We have seen recently a little bit of a trend on disclosure of people now going, there's no general disclosure. You can't simply say, oh, well, you showed us the data room, therefore we knew about it. If you've got something you need to disclose, you need to specifically signpost it. But that means there's a lot more work to be done and a lot more indexing. And I think there's a couple of lawyers listening. It means there's some increase in legal fees. But bottom line is with M&A, there's more compliance in deals. They do cost more to get right because we are in riskier environments because of the increased compliance legislation. So you've got to get this bit right, and you've got to create that sold as seen position. So I'm going to stop in a minute and bring Sally in, and we'll actually look live. We've got some great questions in as well. So we'll look live at some of the M&As that we've done and actually turn some of this, kind of theory into, well, what actually happened in the room on some actual deals. But I do want to go back to a fundament, which, sort of mentioned before about being non-adversarial. I mentioned before about negotiation being about listening. But, if you're looking at negotiation theory as win-win is the only way you get a deal, and by the way, some people think lose-lose is also as effective. I think that's semantics, but from a comment, both sides are happy, if you like, and have agreed to push it through. But when you look at that and you look at research and you look at listening, the biggest thing about non-adversarial is actually building relationships with the other side. So you need to spend time in building that relationship, and the more trust you can get with them, even though you're playing a game with them, the far more likely you are to create a deal. And the fundamentals of that is the Aristotle quote here, which is, a negotiation is not a persuasion game, it's an influencing game. So if they know people all of that helps. And actually, taking the time to build that rapport and conversations with people about what they're like as individuals is always the heart of this, however strong your business is and or your negotiation position. So I'm going to bring my colleague Sally Hardman in now, and we're going to bring some of her more practical experience recently in on some deals that we've done, but also try and this is your chance, guys. We've already got some good questions in. So to bring some questions from you into some of the areas that we're seeing and what we've just discussed. So Sally, if I could ask you to join in, that would be great. I might be able to turn your video on even. There you go. There we go. So there we go. There she is.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Sally. So, what have I got right? What have I got wrong? What strikes you out of what I've covered there?
Well, I think you've covered a lot there, and as you say, sort of in practice, you're having to deal in the room, aren't you? You're dealing with people, and the textbook doesn't always work. I think a good example is the cultural differences is absolutely valid, but in reality, none of us have the time to become experts in every global culture. From a negotiation perspective, unless you're very focused on Chinese negotiation or American. And we've certainly done numerous deals, haven't we, with I can think of French, German, Chinese, Indian and American, and actually just employing some of the other tactics of non-adversarial, being professional, knowing your tradables, doing your research of the individuals can stand you in very good stead as just a bedrock for communicating with people and developing that relationship where everyone wants to have that win-win. I'm not sure I agree that lose-lose is as good as win-win, but as you say, that's probably semantics.
Well, it's a comment. If you bought something you've always paid too much, and if you sold it, you always pay. You always undersold it. It's just the way we think, psychology, and that. But
I had that very recently on a deal where we got the headline price we wanted. It seemed a bit too easily with buy side. We're always very careful not to give in too quickly. And yes, my client would regularly say, "Have we undersold?" And I'd have to keep reminding him that you're never going to know. You have to know whether you've got a price you're happy with. Buyer's never going to know if they've overpaid, which in this case they had. Our client would have accepted a lower deal.
Well, I think that's good. We've had one question here, actually. It should be good, Sally, for you. In your experience, what's the biggest mistake owners make in negotiations? Because we're there, we're trying to protect them, we're the coach, but in the end, they're also in the room. Where did they go wrong?
Where they go wrong was your comment right at the beginning that you say you have a tendency to do and have to hold yourself back on. They talk too much, and they get normally being so enthusiastic, which is fantastic, but the enthusiasm for talking about the business and the commercials spills over into the deal, and they've got too involved in that negotiation themselves, which generally is a mistake. Even if it's not a mistake at that point in time, it becomes a mistake later on when the buyer feels they have access to the seller directly.
Yeah, that's quite common. The non-advisor call Friday night when I've had a glass of wine call. That's a problem.
I had the only deal in recent years, really the last 5 years, that we got to heads of terms and didn't complete was in part because my client's wife changed her mind. I think she worked out she wasn't quite sure what her husband was going to do day to day. But the catalyst for it was exactly that. The buyer and seller had met up a couple of times. It was during COVID, so we weren't all rushing to the table to do it together. But they had met up, got on really well, developed a really good rapport. The advisors were at the 11th hour sort of wading through the working capital calculations and negotiations. We had a slight disagreement in terms of how to deal with it, but the accountants and I were working through it. And the buyer decided to leap in directly with the sellers and try and, what the sellers thought, would bully them into agreeing it. The buyer thought he was being charming.
Yeah.
That was the end of that.
Mistiming of negotiation. Interesting. I mean, one of the things I mentioned tactics earlier. One of the tactics I've seen a lot is where buyers try and undermine the advisor. Oh, I can't get hold of them, or they seem to be being very difficult on this particular point. I don't know whether they can get it, and then they deliberately go direct in order to try and get advantage. Do you agree that that's played a lot as a tactic?
I haven't seen that so much, I must admit, but as you know, I sort of tend to be all over everything, and
a control freak.
You could call it a control freak. I like to call it being efficient. But, what I see more is at the initial stages with buyers when we're having meetings. So there's a private equity buyer trying to undermine a trade buyer and why the client shouldn't sell to trade, or vice versa, trade buyers trying to undermine private equity and say why they're terrible buyers and that sort of thing. So I just tend to sort of grin wryly, knowing that I've covered it off with my clients in advance anyway. And again, it doesn't actually do the buyer any favour. Just being authentic about themselves is a much better tactic.
I think that's probably right. I mean, and we've had a question here from Pav, Sally. I'm sure every deal is different, but commonly, how much will a buyer lower their opening offer by what they may ultimately be willing to pay? So, we could agree something at heads of terms. Back to that deal attrition. Yeah, but the world's changed now. It's 3 months later, and we didn't know. We're going to pay you $1 million less the day before completion. Does that happen?
Again, no, we don't see it very often during the due diligence process. And the reason for that is the best way to avoid deal attrition is to be upfront in the beginning. We know, and our clients know, where there are concerns, challenges in the business, the marketplace. Okay, none of us can predict a pandemic. None of us can predict a war in Europe. Things do change. And I'll give you an example of that. But if we're upfront with any challenges that are upcoming, be it a framework coming to an end, I had one recently with a client where their whole business was being put out to a tender process. So all of these things, if you deal with them, providing solutions to buyers, it's much easier. It also then starts developing that relationship and trust with the buyer from the upfront, that you're not trying to hide anything. And in that way, they're not looking for problems during due diligence. But things do come out. So one example, we were, I don't know, probably 2 weeks from completion, and one of the top 4 lawyers who was doing the financial DD on behalf of the buyer suddenly announced, this was a healthcare company, suddenly announced, should you be VAT registered? When they weren't. They'd been given the advice they shouldn't be. Their clients, who were the CCGs, were happy that they weren't. And you can imagine the can of worms that opened up. And anyone sort of joining us today who knows anything about VAT, it isn't black and white, and especially in the healthcare sector, it is an extremely grey area. And we took legal counsel, and when I say we, this is the point, buy side and sell side together. We went, this is a problem, we need to deal with it for everyone's sake, for the company's sake. So we will work together and taking third-party opinions. We couldn't get any conclusion from third-party opinions because they all differed. So we just took the ball by the horns in dealing with how can we address this and still make the deal happen. And that's what we did. So we worked with the clients to explain that we were going to register for VAT to cover off any issue. It was all reclaimable anyway. The deal could go ahead, and our clients were protected by becoming VAT registered quickly in the future, but without upsetting the apple cart. So again, we did that because we've been non-adversarial throughout. We were working on a win-win basis, buyer and seller working together, and we fixed the problem. So in answer to the question, we rarely see price knocks through due diligence. I think the question also was dealing with what stage with lowball offers coming in, will buyers then upgrade those? And the answer is quite often by as much as 100%.
Yeah.
And part of our job at Avondale is our clients quite often don't see those lowball offers, because we don't want to undermine that rapport that could be built up between buyer and seller. And sometimes it's not necessarily a tactic, it is a genuine lack of awareness of what the value is. And that's our job, to work with them to explain why the value is what we want it to be.
Which is because we had the question here, how do you know when to walk away from a negotiation? But I mean, a key point, which I'll put to you in a sec out of that question. So, but a key point to that is if you've got an alternative, it's a lot easier to do it. And if you've run an auction beforehand, therefore you've got 2 or 3 bids, it's a lot easier to do it. And you come back to the point I made earlier, if you go into a room going, look, we think we may want to sell, but you know, if it's not right, we won't. And we're very clear what we're going to do with the business otherwise. So you then got, they call it a BATNA, don't they? Best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And I think that's fundamental. But with all of that, you've got your auction, you've got your best bid, you've gone ahead to terms, you've got exclusivity, you've got your BATNA. Some deals get sticky, don't they? They just don't go right. So when do you walk away, Sally?
It's a really difficult one. There is no absolute answer to that. For me, it's a gut feeling. And quite often it's a gut feeling. I work with my clients with this, is when we're both on the same page and feel now's the right time. I had a client during the pandemic, and I'm sure you can all understand the pandemic was fun time for deal making. Things were changing rapidly, both commercially, but both from a funder's perspective. So we did have a bit of sort of toing and froing with deals. But I had one client, it was very personal for her. She was going through some family difficulties as well. The buyer kept chopping and changing the funder, and she'd be on the phone for probably most evenings at about 7, 8 o'clock when she'd finish work. I'm pulling out, Sally, she'd say. And quite often I'd be saying, I agree, I think you should pull out, but then she'd change her mind. So, and the deal did happen in the end. It was fractious and it was difficult, but I think it's just gut feeling, and it's important not to let it drag too long, because you waste a lot of time. Once you know it's not right, it's best to make the decision. They say, pull the plaster off quickly.
Yeah. And I think within that, you've got to remember why you're doing it all in the first place. Because what can happen with deals, and I kind of call it going native, is it's sort of when you've got such a vested interest, both as an advisor, but everybody else in the resources behind the deal, you've lost the original focus to it, and therefore you've lost that instinct as to whether it's right. So what do we call that? Deal fatigue, don't we? We're all so knackered we can't think clearly.
I think you put your heart and everyone's put their heart and soul into it for so long. The thought of walking away from it is just physically painful, but sometimes it is the right thing to do.
Yeah. So I'm not encouraging this, guys, but sometimes it is worth having a really good bottle of wine on hand when you're doing a negotiation, just for that one night when you need to go, right, I can't deal with it anymore, I'm turning off. No, I'm not encouraging that, but it can be quite stressful. And we've got the question here, what are the biggest tension points and why? But I'm going to extend that question, and how do you deal with the stress, especially if we do it all the time. Sally, you've done over 100, so you kind of know how to manage the stress. But for a seller, this is their baby, right? Oh my God.
To be honest with you, there are so many different tension points, and to anyone thinking of selling, I'm probably putting you off, but they're different for different people. Due diligence is always a tension point. Because it's so much work, it's so much time and effort, and by the very nature of it, you're going to get the same question asked 3 or 4 different times by different people, and sometimes repeated by the same person. And it is just a case, and I am advocating that bottle of wine or the gin and tonic or whatever it is, a cup of tea, but just take yourself away from it, go and relax and think of the end goal, because you've got a data room with thousands of pieces of information in it by that point. And again, put yourself in the other person's shoes. Yes, the buyer wants to know something. They're not going to realistically scroll through every piece of paper to see if it's there. So they are going to ask repetitive questions. And it's just a case of patience, ploughing through it. And as my client did, phone me up every night at 7, 8 o'clock, sometimes just to have a moan. If you haven't got someone in your family you can moan to, just get it off your chest and then go back to it. But just accept. I had a client once during due diligence that said to me, I only work 2 days a week, this is going to take me forever. And I had to point out, well, yes, if you want to get millions of pounds in your bank account, you might have to work more than 2 days a week for the next 3 months. Yeah. Just accept that this process is going to take up your life for 3 months. And that would probably be a lot easier.
I can remember also to help with that due diligence with one client, we bought them a scanner because they were with paper, and so use the tech, use the data room, make your life easier because then all the advisors, if we look at data rooms, we did a deal recently with LDC that was about 40 odd million, something like that, and there were 50 people in that room. Well, without having a data room that could cope with that and creating the picture across all the advisors rather than replicating or duplicating, you couldn't have managed it. Why are there 50 people these days? It's compliance. Legislation's gone heavy. I think, we look at our jobs, it used to be a sales job. It's increasingly a technical job on managing risk and transparency. And that's the nature of legislation in the market. So if you think about tension, it normally is also legislative, isn't it? It's like, we want to do it, but oh my God, we've missed this or we've missed that on the legislation, and that's a big area that comes up.
I also think coming back to the tension, it then comes back to the prior question about the biggest mistake is let us take the tension where possible. So if your communication is with your advisors, and hopefully trusted advisors that you can be yourself with and express how you're genuinely feeling, you're not having to put a brave face and dealing direct with buy side. Leave that to us.
And also, Sally, where you're brilliant. Sally is one of our best deal makers. She's got a psychology degree. She's a great listener. She doesn't always have to fix every problem because sometimes they don't need to be fixed. You phone me on a deal, I'm always figuring out the way to fix it. But again, getting to know your advisor and also their character type will help you in running the deal. Because sometimes there aren't answers to stuff. Time is the fix, isn't it? People need to go away and reflect, and itself that an answer. Again, do we really want to do this? It's important. I suppose the other thing on negotiation.
At that point, Kevin, sorry to interrupt. I think again it's coming back to putting yourself in the other person's shoes. I was talking to a client yesterday who were just starting to get offers in on the business, and we discussed deferred payments. And like all sellers, they weren't keen on the idea of deferred payments. but will still want maximum value for the business. Of course they do, and they should get that. But I just had to explain from a buyer's perspective what the purpose of the deferred payment is. And if you want a value based on 2022 projections, then the buyer has to mitigate their risk a bit. And by refusing a deferred payment, you're sending the wrong signals. Straight away came back and said, okay, we get it. So sometimes it's just explaining, because we've seen so many deals. Most sellers haven't. Most sellers, this is their first and only deal.
And I think that's a really important area which we'll sort of just cover before we start drawing to a close today. But to come back to the earnout, because how many deals have earnouts, what percentage, but also one of the key elements is how you structure those earnouts. So we actually quite like earnouts because they allow for those forecasts, particularly when you've got markets like at the moment where you've got high inflation risk, probably suppressing margins because you haven't yet managed to change pricing and all that sort of stuff going on. Earnouts can be good, but only if structured properly. And some sellers are like, oh, I've been told by the lawyer I've got to discount any earnout, I may not get it. What's your experience on this stuff, Sally?
It's about structuring an earnout that is viable. Interestingly, I've had 2 offers in the past 3 weeks with all cash on completion. I'm sure it's just coincidence. I'd love to think it's a trend going forward. But as you said, we do like an earnout. The latest deal I've completed, we had a valuation based on a sensible multiple, mostly payable on completion, with a small deferred element linked to retaining a key client for a year. We then had 2 years of earnout to see growth above current EBITDA levels. So there's a maximum 1.5 million a year the client can earn for 2 years if the business grows above current EBITDA, which is fantastic. They'll be in there running the business, so they've got something to really get the teeth into and a second bite of the cherry in terms of earning some money. But yes, that's a good example of tradables from a negotiation point of view, because the buyer was fairly set in his mind as to what that first year target would be, which we were very comfortable with the pipeline. We also didn't tell the buyer that. We fought hard to reduce it and lost, as we knew we would, but that stood us in really good stead to win a lower target on the second year earnout, which is where we really had more concerns about whether or not we'd be able to hit it. So that was a perfect win-win. Buy side didn't know that we sort of traded with them, but everyone's happy.
And I love, for me, tactically, I would call that, it's not only a tradable, but there's a smoke screen, isn't it? Just pushing out something that's not so important, making a fuss about it, and actually, it's not the one. We have one more question here. Is there an average time restriction on going back into the market post-deal? I think you could interpret that 2 ways. Post-deal if the negotiations have aborted, and also post-deal if you bought a company.
Or are you talking about restricted covenants in terms of...
Or it could be restricted covenants. I'm not sure.
Can
we do all 3?
Well, if it's restricted covenants, as in the shareholders being able to go back and work in that industry, obviously we need to define what that industry is, what client sectors, what geography, but normally you'd be looking at a couple of years. If we're talking about going back after an aborted deal, that's a very personal choice. It depends really how painful the aborted deal was and whether or not, as sellers, you need a bit of time to regroup. Or it may well be the deal was aborted because of some commercial issue that needs to be resolved. So obviously it makes sense to then go and resolve that before going back to the market. In terms of from a purchaser's perspective, so long as you've got, and I've got a good example of that at the moment, that partly because of COVID, partly because of the fast growth of business, we were kind of deal attrition really. It just went on too long. We didn't have momentum behind it, and we did take the view we should stop now. Let's go back to the market. But we've gone back to the same buyer and told them what we're doing. So we haven't paused particularly. We just feel we need a fresh start. And I'm talking to buyers that we talked to first time round. We explain the situation, they understand. So as long as we have a story behind it and they're not left guessing as to why would they buy an asset nobody else wanted, then we don't have a problem.
That's very good, Sally. So I'm sort of mindful of time. Is there any summing up you want to do from you're passionate about, from your 20 years of deal making? My experience is this is the one thing you must do.
Be open-minded, probably. I can't remember my exact phrase. I said to a client yesterday, We obviously talk to clients before we go to the market about likely deal size, likely deal structure, values, etc. But an offer is never an offer until it's come from someone who's offering, because the deal you will do will depend on who's the other side of that, their credibility, their plans for business, their ethos, and quite simply whether or not you get on and you like them. So be open-minded. I had an 8 o'clock meeting this morning with clients who are on holiday. That's my point about you giving up your life through this process a bit. And they were reticent about meeting these people. I said, come on, I think you're going to like them. And they've come out of it the other end going, okay, you're right. They've got a lot to offer and a lot to say. So yeah, just be open-minded to it.
I think that's great. And mine would be the third-party observer. So you put yourself in the buyer's shoes or the seller's shoes, so you've seen it both ways, but actually there is a third-party thinking, which is, what would somebody completely external say about that? You know, so a good example, when you've started selling your business, you thought 15 million was going to be the target, you were happy with that, you're getting offers, you're beating all that, then you're in the small stuff and you've got a 21 million pound offer and you're arguing about it. What would the third party say to you? Then they, you know, push past the advisor. It just creates that open-mindedness that Sally's talking about. So it's a reframing technique. You put yourself in your shoes. What would I say? What would the buyer say? But what would an absolutely independent, impartial observer say? And then that helps you stay calm, because actually, at the end of it, that's the fundament, isn't it? Keep calm and carry on with deals. So, thank you all for listening. We've got a recording. We'll circulate that. We have got some more webinars coming up, which I will just share the screen on to remind you when they are. So if you've enjoyed these, that's hopefully been useful. We have got a knowledge bank on our system now, which is basically it's got, I think, about 80 articles, 12, 13 webinars, loads of videos, podcasts, and so on. So if you need CPD, professional development on M&A, there's all sorts of content material. So please, please, please take a look. If you think there's any content missing, do shout, because we're always looking for new ideas to get that out there to help educate best practice. So hope you've really enjoyed today. Sally, thank you for joining and really appreciated. And we'll catch you all later. Thanks all.
Bye. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye. Bye.